Hello everyone. So in this video, I want to talk about a big topic, enlightenment. Enlightenment is a big word, even sounds scary, so much it looks big. We heard of enlightenment in many contexts, like the idea of nirvana, of some kind of absolute omniscience, some kind of like maybe the solution to everything, the end of everything. I mean, enlightenment is really a big thing. It's perceived as such a big thing that it almost seems something unapproachable, something impossible, something that you cannot achieve unless you are willing to be a monk in a temple for 30 years. You shouldn't even try. You shouldn't even think that you can have a normal life and reach enlightenment. This is kind of the way it's perceived, the way we imagine. But in reality, most people have no idea what enlightenment is because it has been inflated so much with all those stories and all those ideas that we really have a hard time to even imagine what it could be in actual practical terms. So to start, I will try to give some synonyms of enlightenment just to make it look more approachable and less scary, to look less big, something that can actually be done with a little bit of effort. Of course, it requires some effort, but it's not something impossible. A good synonym, another way to say enlightenment, will be to say the dropping of the conditioned mind, to drop the conditioned mind. Now, what is the conditioned mind? Well, let's see first what is the mind. The mind, we could say, is the information that is in the brain. So lots of people have similar brains probably, but their minds can be very different. So the mind could be, let's say, if we use a book as a metaphor, lots of books are similar in the sense that they are books, but the content of the book is very different. Just like people's brain can be very similar, but their minds can be very different. So the mind will be the content, the information that is in the brain, just like the text is the information that is in the book and the book is the container. We could say that the mind is the information that is in the brain and the brain is the container. So now that we have defined the mind, what is the conditioning? What makes the mind conditioned? Belief, assumption, idea, anything that we think is real without having experienced it. So usually the sentence that is used is, we are conditioned to believe. Because of course, if we experience directly, we believe. A child is going to touch, let's say, a hot stove and is going to get burned, and is going to believe that hot stoves are hot. There is no, it's a belief, but it's not a conditioning. It's a belief that is built on direct experience. If you can drive a car and you have experience driving a car, not just read about it, you know how to do it, you know it's possible, you believe it's possible, you believe you can do it, but this is not a conditioning. There is no conditioning. You just know from direct experience. A conditioning will be when someone told you, or could be your parents, the school, your friends, the church, the TV, the newspaper, anything is going to tell you something about reality that you should consider as true, but that you have not directly experienced. Now, if you experience it eventually, it's not a conditioning. So it's like, let's say someone explained you how to drive before you ever go into a car. You study, you learn from them how to drive, but you have not yet done it. So at that stage, it will still be a condition. You believe certain ideas about how it has to be done, how it works, etc., etc. Then at some point, you get into the car and you drive. Now it's not a conditioning anymore. But certain of your previous beliefs could very well be abandoned. Maybe your teacher told you you have to do it in this way, and you're going to do it in a different way. So now you have direct experience, and then it's not a condition. But certain things, we will never get direct experience. Let's say, for example, Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is a belief that children have. They have been told that there is such a thing as Santa Claus, and they will believe it without having experienced it. That's why it is a conditioning. Now, they cannot experience it, of course, because it doesn't exist, but they can realize at some point that it does not exist. How they can realize that it does not exist? Usually through logic. So they can think about it and try to understand if it makes sense or not. Of course, they cannot experience it, but they can wonder, so is it supported by something solid? Is there, maybe if not solid evidence, some solid assumption, some solid reasoning behind it? Does it explain the world better? Is it easier to explain the world with Santa Claus or without Santa Claus? Does the explanation of Santa Claus solve more problems than it creates, or creates more problems than it solves? This is usually a good criteria. It's not perfect, but it's usually a good criteria. So let's look at Santa Claus. So in Santa Claus, a few weird things happen. So first of all, we have this big man. He lives in the North Pole, and once a year on 25th of December, he distributes gifts. Now, first of all, we can start to question why 25th December. 25th December is also the birth date of Jesus. It's also the day where the day and the night have the same duration. So it's basically the end. It's the end of days getting shorter and the beginning of days getting longer, which is an interesting coincidence. So Santa Claus decides to distribute gifts to children on that specific day. Already, I will say that's a little bit suspicious. And then he goes with those animals. I forgot the name, like in English, they are like deers, but they're not deers, but they kind of look like deers. So those animals that they carry his coach. Now those animals, they don't have wings, so it's weird. I mean, to accept this as true, we will have to accept that certain animals can fly without wings, which it never happens. We have no evidence of animals flying without wings. And then there is the case that allegedly he goes through the chimney, but a lot of houses have no chimneys anymore. And it doesn't look like in the morning the glasses were broken or the doors were broken. So how did he enter? Now, if he can teleport, which of course would put into question the laws of physics, then why does he need those deers and his coach, since he can teleport? So there are some inconsistencies. Now, I grew up in Italy, and I guess the labels on the toys were probably in Italian. And I assume that a Chinese child will see labels in Chinese, and a German child in German. Okay, so then those toys don't all come from the North Pole. It seems that they come from the same country usually. And then there are some interesting correlations. Like, for example, children of rich parents are likely to get more expensive gifts, and children of poor parents are likely to get cheaper gifts. That's probably a very, very strong correlation. And it will seem weird for Santa Claus to be so specific in his desire and intention to ensure that if a child is from a rich family, they should consistently get expensive toys. And if a child is from a poor family, they should consistently get cheap toys. And of course, we can probably identify many more inconsistencies. So through thinking, we can realize that probably the idea of Santa Claus, the conditioning of Santa Claus, doesn't make sense. Now, of course, that's an easy one. Most children probably stop believing in Santa Claus by the age of 6 or 7, but there are way more conditioning. I'm using Santa Claus only as an example. There are many more conditioning that are much more difficult to eradicate, and that most adults will keep having all their life. They will not manage to remove them. They will not manage to see through the inconsistencies. They will not manage to see through the incoherence, through the contradictions. They will just keep the conditioning. So that's what the conditioning is. It's really like a piece of information that in some way or another, through our parents, through the school, through the newspaper, through the religion, through the books, lives in our brain. And it usually distorts our reality because it's like a story. It's a story that we tell ourselves. So it's a conditioning. So there are many, many conditionings in our mind. And the goal of enlightenment is really to remove those conditionings. So once we remove those conditionings, then we can see a lot more clearly. I mean, I think everyone can appreciate that a child that has seen through the illusion of Santa Claus has a much more clear view of reality. He can see things in a much more clear way. And just like there is the Santa Claus illusion, let's say, the Santa Claus conditioning, there are many more, much more difficult to eradicate. But once we eradicate them, we can see things in a much more clear way. So of course we still have a mind. There is no such thing as the mind drops, there is no mind, and this doesn't make sense. But what we remove is the conditioned mind, which really is just the conditionings of our mind. So we only retain things that we have directly experienced, or things that make sense, that are coherent. We don't make or accept assumptions that are based on nothings. We don't anymore take in assumptions that are based on nothing. So if we take assumptions, they have to be based on something. If not, we just don't take them. So that's the idea of the conditioned mind, which is really just a synonym for enlightenment. Let's look into this enlightenment thing in a more practical way. So we looked at the idea of the conditioned mind. We looked at what those conditionings are and how they exist in our brain and how we get to remove them. But let's look at what the experience of enlightenment or having dropped the conditioned mind looks like. The key difference is the idea that we stop telling ourselves stories. Now, this appears to be very simple, but I have to elaborate a little bit more. So in Buddhism, there is this concept of first dart and second dart. And there is this distinction between, let's say, pain and suffering. And the goal of the Buddha is basically to free himself and others from suffering. But first, what is the difference between pain and suffering? So pain is the first dart, is the thing that actually happens. So you fall, you break your leg, you feel pain. That's first dart. Everyone is going to experience that. But then, usually, you start to tell yourself a story. And this story is the second dart, and is the suffering. The suffering is really a story. It's what it means to you to have broken your leg. Maybe it's like, oh, I will never manage to walk again. I will lose my job because I cannot walk. How I'm going to feed my family? I will be worthless if I cannot walk. Those are the stories. This is the suffering. And usually those stories exist in our mind because of certain assumptions, because of certain conditionings that are based on nothing. And again, usually through introspection, through analytical thinking and deduction, we can analyze them deeply and understand their causes, observe that they are kind of unreasonable, incoherent, contradictory, and then get rid of them. Of course, we will look at them one by one in the videos, but it's important to understand what enlightenment is. Enlightenment is really about getting rid of those stories, but not through some effort, not through some kind of meditation or focused attention or some attempt to silence the mind. It's like Santa Claus. Once you have realized that Santa Claus does not exist, there is no way, even if you wanted to believe again in Santa Claus. It does not require effort to not believe in Santa Claus. It is the natural state once you realize it doesn't exist. And not only, any amount of effort will not be sufficient to force yourself to believe in Santa Claus again after you have stopped believing. So this is not about, again, meditation, focused attention, or controlling the breath or controlling your thought. It's not about that. It's about realization. A realization is when you understand something. And when you realize something, you cannot unrealize it. There is no going back. Once you realize something, there is no going back. So the key part is that realization requires effort to go through the process of realization. But once the realization is made, there is no effort required to maintain the realization. Actually, any amount of effort will not be sufficient to remove the realization. So realization requires effort to achieve the realization, but once it is achieved, no amount of effort is required to keep it, to maintain the realization. Actually, any amount of effort is not enough to lose the realization. You cannot, no matter how much effort you put, you cannot believe in Santa Claus again. So this is what enlightenment is. It's the same as the idea of dropping the conditioned mind. It's the idea of getting rid of all those stories, assumptions, etc., that we can also call suffering, because the suffering is related to the mind. So the pain is related to the body. It's like you break your leg. The suffering is related to the mind. It's the story you tell yourself. So of course, we cannot affect the pain that we feel when we break our leg, but we can affect the stories that our mind is going to create when we break our leg. Like, I will never be able to walk again, or oh, I'm going to feed my family, or what is going to happen to me, or why me? This is so unfair. I'm such a good guy. Why I have to break my leg? Those stories, this suffering, very significantly amplifies the pain that we have. Most of the time, the suffering is much stronger than the pain, because the suffering can also exist when there is no pain. Sometimes we suffer just because we think about certain things, or we compare ourselves to others, or we compare ourselves to what we believe we should be, or we judge ourselves, or we judge others, or we think that things should be in a different way, or that people should act in a different way, or things could have been different. There are all those stories that exist in our mind that create suffering. And we are going to look step by step at what are the foundations of those stories. What are the assumptions? What are the beliefs? What are the conditionings that support those stories. And how exactly can we get rid of them? By realizing that they are incoherent, that they make no sense. And realize that they are, after all, just stories. They don't really disappear, they just exist as stories. After all, you still know what Santa Claus is, but you don't believe in its actual existence. You just believe in Santa Claus as a story. Now, this is the same. Enlightenment is really the idea that, of course, the stories still exist, but they exist as stories. So we stop confusing those stories for reality. So before enlightenment, while the mind is conditioned by the stories, we confuse the stories with the reality. After enlightenment, once we drop the conditioned mind, we stop confusing the stories with the reality. The distinction is very clear. The reality, or what we believe to be real, to be more specific, is only what we have experienced or what makes really, really good sense. What we have not experienced and doesn't make a lot of sense is going to be removed, is going to be scrapped. It's just going to be seen as a fantasy, as a story, something that is certainly not real. The conditioning in some way is the confusion between the story and the reality. And the enlightenment is this creating this disconnect between the story and the reality. So we see the story for what it is, just a story. And once we realize that it is just a story, then its power to cause suffering is completely removed. So that's what enlightenment is. It's nothing supernatural or mystical or whatever. It's not something unachievable. Now, it is difficult because those conditioning, those beliefs, those stories are deeply radicated in our mind. So it's not easy to remove them. But it is doable. It is not a miracle. It is a process of introspection, a process of thinking, a process of gaining more clarity. It has nothing to do with meditation or separating oneself from society or going to temples or praying. It's mostly a process of thinking. And once we make the realization, we are good. There is absolutely no effort to be done to keep it. So I hope that this is a helpful introduction to what enlightenment is, and then in the following videos, we will look more in detail about the different steps to reach enlightenment.